Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the content patch for the 4th of March 2013. My name is TotalBiscuit with today's gaming news and comment. Coming up in the show, SimCity will be getting city size expansions at a later date. 44% of surveyed game developers plan to try crowdfunding. PC development is quite reasonable, claims the Devil May Cry producer. Dead Island Riptide gets its pre-order DLC bonuses revealed. Oh, you'll love this. And a Modern Warfare 4 beta scam doing the rounds that you will need to keep an eye out for. Maxis creative director Ocean Quigley, which is a wonderful name, has spoken on the subject of the size or maximum size of cities within the forthcoming SimCity title. He claimed that it was just a performance decision. Given that the performance was a constraint we decided to work under, we built a larger region environment and a bunch of multiplayer to work with 2-kilometer square cities. At some point in the future, especially with mainstream computers becoming more capable, we could certainly make the city sizes larger. He went on to say that the game was designed to run on your dad's PC as well as yours, and that they'd eventually get around to expanding the city size, but they can't make any promises as to when. Now, this is an interesting statement, honestly, because I'm going to do my big impressions on SimCity pretty soon. I've played a good amount of it, and I've got a lot to say on it, but let's have a little bit of a preview of that by talking about the city size issue. It's odd that he would claim that it was just performance-based. Now, I can definitely understand the idea that this has got to run on a lot of PCs. The reason it's got to run on a lot of PCs is because SimCity is a very popular franchise amongst a large age demographic. I would hazard a guess that SimCity is one of the games that are played by older people in comparison to pretty much everything else on the market when it comes to actual core games rather than just casual stuff on an iPhone or anything like that. I have known of many people that have played SimCity that are way beyond what you would expect the normal age range demographic of gamers to be. We're talking about people in their 40s, 50s, even older than that, 60s, 70s. My granddad was still alive. He actually did play SimCity, and he was 75 at the time, so there's something to consider. So obviously, you've got to make this game run on pretty much everyone's PC, as much as humanly possible at any rate. The weird thing about it is that that sort of conflicts with the idea that it's got this whole always-on DRM thing going on. If you really wanted it to run on as many PCs as possible, you wouldn't necessarily require a reliable internet connection in order to do that. Perhaps their surveys indicate that yes, people do have that kind of access these days. That's a possibility, but it's very hard to say, especially considering you're talking about an international release across the world. Who knows? I mean, who knows what kind of people would get a hold of this and just not be able to play it thanks to the always-on requirement. The processing issue is also an interesting point. I've heard a lot of chatter coming from Maxis claiming that a lot of the grunt work is actually done on the server side end of things, so it's doing a lot of the calculations, so it's actually taking some load off your machine. It's hard to say just how much, but a recent Reddit post on the matter indicated there was a fairly large amount of data being transferred between your machine and the server on an hourly basis, which would be indicative that there is quite a lot of calculation going on the server sside end. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not enough to really cause a lot of concern. According to measurements taken with BitMeter, it was doing about 32.2 megabytes an hour downloaded data and uploading 46 megs. That's not a lot during an hour's worth of play at all. That kind of speed should reliably run on pretty much any connection whatsoever. But yeah, that's still a reasonable amount of data being transferred. Is it enough to really say, well, there's a lot of performance load that's being taken off here by some server in the cloud? Well, that's a different matter entirely. That's far more technical. Here's the thing about city size, though. This is the thing that they're not actually mentioning. It seems to me, having played quite a bit of the beta, my impression is that the city size thing was a deliberate design decision and it wasn't necessarily based on technical capabilities. There's nothing necessarily stopping them from having an area that was just twice the size and saying, let the buyer beware. Just say, this is a high-spec area, chances are you can only build cities here if you've got a high-spec machine, done. That's not very difficult to do. That's something they could have sorted out. But here's the thing, though. The game itself seems to be balanced around having these smaller cities. There's this design philosophy running underneath the surface, which is fairly easy to spot, that says, we built this game around the idea that you build several smaller cities in a region, and those cities collaborate, cooperate, and sometimes hurt each other in some way, and that's the way that we want the new SimCity to be. This is how we design things, and this is how it's going to be. That seems to be why the cities are the size that they are. They don't necessarily want a city that can be a huge megalopolis on its own and require nothing from the rest of the region. The first city that I made is pretty successful. It's got about 55,000 people in it. It has booming industry. It has some seriously high-tech and expensive stuff. Nuclear power plant running everything. Some really, really high-quality buildings. And low crime, pretty much low everything. It's got great transportation links and so on and so forth. But it lacks some key stuff. It lacks any kind of educational resources. I just can't fit them in my city. I physically can't fit them in there. And that's as a result of the limited size. And I have to wonder if that's what they really were doing with it. It's not just down to technical problems. There's nothing stopping them from having a larger map and saying, well, you run the risk that it might not work all that well. There's nothing stopping them from doing that at all. That's absurd. But it seems like they design things in this way. It also affects the balance of it. If you have this larger city, then you then have people playing in a way that the game wasn't necessarily designed to be played in. Let's say there's a city that's 8x8 instead of 2x2. In theory, you should be able to make that city entirely self-sufficient and basically fit everything that you could possibly desire into that city. And then what need do you have of the region? And the answer would be, well, you don't. And that seems to be flying in the face of Max's design philosophy when it comes down to how SimCity runs. The question I suppose you'll have to ask yourself, and I'll go much more in depth on this in the video that I do of this quite soon, is whether or not that design philosophy is what you are looking for in SimCity. Because if it's not, of course, it may be something you want to avoid. If it's something that you're willing to buy into, then I think that you will find that to be fairly reasonable. But we'll see what happens. I'm intrigued to see when they decide to expand this, how they decide to do it, and what kind of balance changes they need to make in order to have that happen, or whether or not they even need to bother at all. At the end of the day, even though it's got multiplayer connectivity, it's still, by all means, a single-player sandbox game. If you want to break it, that is really entirely up to you. In a GDC survey on the subject of crowdfunding, it was found that 44% of surveyed game developers plan to try it, although only 8% of those surveyed had actually worked on a crowdfunded project in the first place, and only 4% said that crowds were their primary source of actual funding. Now, as far as I'm concerned, that survey is actually chock full of some really interesting information that could be several topics, really. But I want to talk a little bit about the crowdfunding aspect of things. I don't necessarily think that this is very surprising. Honestly, crowdfunding is one of the least risky things you can do as long as you're pretty certain you can deliver. The only thing which you're putting at risk, really, is your reputation. If you don't deliver, and this is not currently a problem right now, simply because we're not far enough into 2013 to really be demanding results from a lot of these Kickstarters and Indiegogos, because their dates were somewhere towards the end of 2013. There's been a couple of projects where people have said, hey, what's going on? Code Hero is one example, and then Anita Sarkazian's stuff as well has been an issue, although it seems that that's coming out now after all. So I don't think we've really entered this phase where people are super skeptical and really critical of Kickstarters and crowdfunded stuff. So in reality, if you can get your game funded by the public, why the hell wouldn't you? I don't think anyone really wants to be bound by the requirements and the oversight of a publisher. I don't think you would ever want to do that. As a creator, why would you? I can imagine someone sort of looking over all of my videos and pushing me in a very particular direction and wanting editorial control over my content, and I would have absolutely hated it. So I can't imagine that developers who are also creative people would have any love for that kind of model whatsoever. And let's be honest, this is essentially a form of legitimized internet panhandling. It does allow, yes, consumers to put money forward and say, we want this game, we are going to make this game happen. But you're still begging for money from the public with no real return. This is not the traditional investment model. So it doesn't really surprise me that so many people want to try crowdfunding. What surprises me more is that over half don't. That's a little bit intriguing. Why wouldn't you sort of give it a shot, I suppose? It's probably good news that all these guys don't just suddenly want to crowdfund everything. I feel that unless you're trying to put something together that is absolutely impossible to fund via the traditional methods, we're talking about stuff like Wasteland 2, yes, Chris Avallone could have thrown a bunch of money at it. Absolutely, he could have probably thrown his life savings at making this game work, but it's a risky thing to do. Could Double Fine have made that adventure game? Well, probably not, because they tried, and this is what kind of started this whole thing. They wanted to make this game, and no publisher would actually give them the money for it, so they had to go to Kickstarter. And there's a few other games that wouldn't have worked out, by the looks of it, via the traditional model, but then there's a lot of other stuff that pops up on Kickstarter, and it's like, well, you probably could have got a traditional publisher for this. You probably could have funded this in a reasonable way, because this game looks pretty decent, and the chances are that someone would pick it up for funding, but you didn't necessarily want them to. I think what people are really worried about is the idea that every developer is just going to go to Kickstarter every time they have some harebrained idea, because they don't want to go through the trouble of trying to find a publisher, they don't want to put their own money into it, so they might as well ask the public. And then you get Kickstarter saturation, Kickstarter fatigue, and the Kickstarters that are actually worth supporting don't get funded because people are just flat out sick of the business model. And that's definitely something that we need to watch out for. So I guess it's reasonable news that the majority of developers surveyed don't want to go for crowdfunded stuff, although there's certainly a rather significant number that do. Speaking to True PC Gaming, which is a rather wonderful website, by the way, and you should go check it out at truepcgaming.com. Quite small, but has some fantastic articles. Alex Jones from Capcom claims that PC game development is actually quite reasonable, and said if you do your job right on the console side, you can generally develop a PC version quite reasonably from both a budget and production logistics standpoint. He went on to mention the help that they had received from a top-notch PC development house, which certainly can't refer to Ninja Theory, since they've never actually done a game on the PC previously, but is most likely related to a company called QLock. Now, he mentioned this company by name in the interview, and QLock specializes in QA, porting, localization, and implementation. Now, it's a little hard to find out all the games they did, but as it turns out, they were actually responsible for Ace Combat, and they were also responsible for Devil May Cry, and looking through their previous references, they did a lot of localization in Polish for games like The Bard's Tale, Dirt 2, Mafia 2, Fallout New Vegas, and some not-so-good stuff like, say, Warhammer Mark of Chaos and Resident Evil 4. Admittedly, they're hardly responsible for the quality of the port there by the looks of it, since they were simply dealing with the localization. This company also apparently helped GSC Game World with the Stalker games, Gaijin Entertainment, who are, of course, currently dealing with Star Conflict and War Thunder. They were QA on a Paradox title, Victoria 2, which I must attest I haven't had the chance to play, so I don't know if that was any good. And they did a bunch of stuff like the Dead Rising PC, Polish, and Russian versions, and all sorts of things like that. It's interesting that they would be noted, of course, as a top-notch PC development house when their list of titles is somewhat mixed, honestly. But they have worked with Capcom before. Turns out they were responsible for Super Street Fighter 4 Arcade Edition, and they did a pretty good job on that, honestly, aside from the fact that it's bound to Games for Windows Live, which is probably the worst albatross around its neck, yet hardly the fault of QLock. Intriguing that he should mention that this is apparently a fairly easy thing to do. He also went on to say that since core fans demanded a 60 frames per second version, that could only be delivered on PC. And he also pointed out that they decided to create a PC version very early in the console development cycle, so that made it a lot easier rather than it just being an afterthought. And he's not wrong. The PC version of Devil May Cry is easily the best out of the 3 currently available by a country mile. It is a good-looking game, it is a very fluid and smooth-running game, and it has a good set of options to go along with it. But I am pretty happy that we do have a major publisher and developer coming out and saying, yeah, you know, doing stuff on PC works. And honestly, Capcom have not released a lot of bad PC games, at least not lately. They've been doing pretty well with MT Framework, and obviously it's a bit of a different case when we're dealing with something like, say, Devil May Cry, because that's an Unreal 3 game, it's developed by Ninja Theory, but most of the games that Capcom has been releasing over the past couple of years, which include mostly the Super Street Fighter and Street Fighter X Tekken games, have been pretty solid. Right, they've been good ports. Even Devil May Cry 4's port was pretty good, and that was, of course, several years ago. We also had fairly reasonable ports of Lost Planet 2, the original Lost Planet, actually. Colonies Edition was not too shabby either, and a couple of other things. So it's hardly that surprising to have Capcom come out and say that, but it's certainly heartening. And it's also good to know that there are companies that these guys can go to that are very much capable when it comes to those PC ports. For instance, Square Enix right now works with a company called Nixes when it comes to dealing with their PC versions, and these guys know what they are doing. They did Deus Ex Human Revolution, they're doing Tomb Raider, they did Hitman Absolution, and if I recall correctly, they also did stuff like Lara Croft and The Guardian of Light. They absolutely know what they're doing, and as a direct result, we are getting good versions. And I think something that we really need to start keeping an eye on when it comes to PC development is who's actually doing these things. Because we hear a development name, and yet more often than not, it's not actually the developer dealing with the PC side of things, it's another company that's actually contracted to handle that port. Now, there are some companies that are very good at it, and there are some companies that are not. So I think what we need to do is start keeping a whitelist of companies that are really, really good at this stuff, and that will help us predict whether or not the PC version of the game is actually going to be up to scratch. Nixes is the first name on the list. Dead Island Riptide has received its pre-order bonuses, including the Survivor Pack, which includes a barbecue blade, which apparently combines a sharp blade with fuel tanks to make a flaming sword, an XP booster, and a special shop which provides discounts and savings on weapons and gear. We also have some other stuff like the Fashion Victim Pack, which is a bunch of co-op skins, and it's also been announced that the DLC will be available to those of you who didn't pre-order on day one for the low price of 400 Microsoft points for the Survivor Pack, so that's $5 your original equivalent, or 160 Microsoft points, which is around $2 for the Fashion Victim Pack. Good lord. Here we go again. Why anyone would pre-order Dead Island Riptide, I have no idea. Dead Island promised a lot and delivered little. I'm hoping that the second game is a lot better. I hope so, but I certainly under no circumstances would pre-order the bloody thing on that basis. Are you kidding me? And in this case, what we have with the Survivor Pack is, of course, something that once again makes the game easier. Stop it! What is wrong with you? Like, I can understand the whole barbecue blade thing. An exclusive weapon, it's a sword with also fire. That's cool. Flaming sword. Great. Sounds like fun. I don't like the fact that you took it out of the game and developed it separately. Maybe it didn't take a long time, but it sounds like it kind of did. That's, you know, at least that's interesting, but an XP booster and a special shop. So you break the economy of the game, and you break the leveling curve of the game, which could mean that the game becomes way easier for anyone that's pre-ordered it, and you think that in a non-competitive co-op game, this is a good idea. You're out of your minds. You have something wrong with you if you believe that is smart. It isn't. It is incredibly stupid, and they need to stop doing that. I mean, even if I wanted to pre-order this game, I wouldn't. And the reason I wouldn't do it is because it would break it. I got code for Dead Space 3, right? So they gave me code and said, you know, here's a day one release copy. We couldn't get you a preview copy, but here's one anyway. And that came with all of the pre-order bonuses. And I started using the weapon in that and instantly realized this thing is overpowered and is making the game less interesting. And I can't get rid of it. You can't actually destroy it. Those parts stay in your inventory forever. So I have to basically play the game with the full knowledge that I have a bunch of weapons sitting in my inventory that's better than what I've got. And this has been going on for so long. You know, the classic example I like to bring up is if you wanted to play Dragon Age, then the best armor to tank in, bar say one set much later in the game, was the Blood Dragon armor. It was the best tank armor in the game, except for a couple of really late game sets. So you were playing this thing for about 60-70 hours. It was ridiculous. Why would you do that? Because you just make the game less interesting. And just making stuff cheaper in the shop in a co-op game, XP boosting, this is not an MMO. Come off it. This is so dumb. And finally, a little public service announcement. Most of you know about this stuff anyway, but I would rather less people get scammed. So, I'm going to remind you that if anyone says, hey, here's this beta thing you can get in, you probably can't. Unless it's announced by the official company, there's no way in a million years that this is going to happen. So currently there's a bunch of sites going around claiming to be invites to the Modern Warfare 4 beta, and as a result, if you decide to go to those sites and put in your details, then you will have your account stolen and so on and so forth. please do keep an eye out for these kind of things. If there is a beta, you can be very much informed and sure can happen to the best of us. I remember losing my WoW account details actually 3 years ago. Thankfully, I had an authenticator, so I didn't get nailed by it, but it was because I got up, it was really, really early, and I was tired, and I put in my details into something that I didn't really realize what it was, and suddenly, boom, account details lost, even though I should have been smarter than that. When there's a beta for these kind of things, the companies will make a huge song and dance about it because beta is now a marketing term, right? And you can make a lot of money, you can get a lot of pre-orders via the beta. Now, when it comes to Modern Warfare, they don't do betas. They just don't. There are no open betas for any of the Modern Warfare games, so why on earth you think they'd suddenly start now and do so via some unofficial site is really beyond me, but please do be careful. There's no way they would run it at this time anyway. It's March, that game's coming out in November. Absolutely no way it's in beta yet, so just be careful and make sure that you don't end up losing your account to something like this. Your Steam account is worth a lot of money these days, so watch out. Alright folks, that's me done for the day. Thank you very much for watching the content patch, and I will see you next time.